Almost as if everyone's already dead.
When Capcom first released Dead Rising back in August of 2006, it was impossible not to take notice. While gamers had been fending off the undead for a decade by that point in the publisher's Resident Evil series, we'd never squared off against anything like the zombie hordes being offered up with their newest franchise. As one of the first true exclusives in the early days of the Xbox 360, Dead Rising was one of the games that Microsoft could point to when they wanted to tout the power of the next generation of gaming. Dead Rising didn't just look better than the games you'd find on the original Xbox, PS2, and GameCube. It was offering an experience that simply hadn't been possible on those consoles. But it wasn't just an impressive tech demo, as it also had a fantastic premise. You weren't a super soldier, and you weren't waging war against the undead in military facilities or haunted graveyards, but rather you were an everyman surviving for 3 days in an old-fashioned mall, with your tools of defense being essentially whatever you could find that wasn't bolted down. It might have drawn some healthy inspiration from George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, but within the gaming industry, Dead Rising stood out as an absolute original. There was no mistaking it for anything else on the market at the time. Most critics raved about it, and fans ate it up like a bunch of hungry zombies, and Capcom would eventually ship 1 million copies of Dead Rising by the end of the year.
Fantastic!
Eventually, it would spawn a Wii port and 3 sequels, becoming one of Capcom's most successful franchises in the process. So clearly, the legacy of the original Dead Rising can't be questioned. However, not all games age the same. Some all-time classics begin to feel dated within a few years, while others that were overlooked hold up for decades. Hey, how's it going everybody? Dusty here, coming at you from the Hotbox, and I hope you all enjoy this look back at the original Dead Rising as I attempt to determine whether it still holds up today. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Alright, now that this shameless self-promotion has been taken care of, let's get back to the good stuff. Dead Rising casts the player as Frank West, a freelance photojournalist who's always on the lookout for the next big scoop. When he gets a tip about something going down in Willamette, Colorado, Frank hires a pilot to fly him into the small town, which has been quarantined by the National Guard. Once it becomes apparent that shit has definitely hit the fan, Frank is unable to contain his journalistic curiosity and jumps headfirst into danger. Despite thinking Frank to be a lunatic and doubting his ability to survive, his pilot does agree to return to pick him up in 3 days' time. After having an ominous chat with a mysterious stranger, Frank then heads into the mall, where he's informed that the incident in Willamette is actually a zombie outbreak.
What? Did you just say zombies?
Though skeptical at first, Frank quickly changes his tune once the zombies get into the mall and start snacking on his fellow survivors. After escaping the entrance plaza, Frank meets and forms an uneasy alliance with Brad and Jesse, 2 agents from the Department of Homeland Security, and resolve to uncover the truth behind the outbreak. Now once you gain full control of Frank, the first thing you'll notice is that the game is constantly counting down to the helicopter's arrival. Games love to introduce time constraints into their story that don't actually affect the gameplay in any way, to artificially increase the narrative tension, and even some of my favorites are guilty of this. Dead Rising, on the other hand, sticks to its word, putting the player on the clock, and if you're not back at the helipad at noon on the 3rd day, then Frank gets left behind. Granted, each day is condensed into roughly 2 actual hours, meaning the whole game can be beaten pretty quickly, but Capcom found some pretty clever ways to extend the runtime that I'll mention in a little bit. And the second thing to become apparent is that Frank is a complete pushover at the start of the game, despite his assertion otherwise.
I've covered wars, you know.
I imagine a good amount of new players die during the opening when Brad tells them to get to the stairs, because if you get swarmed, you could easily lose what little health you do have. Dead Rising wastes no time teaching the player that fighting is not always the best option. After this, you're introduced to the idea of rescuing survivors, which rewards you with prestige points, or PP, yes I know, which in turn levels Frank up. You're then given the mission Backup for Brad, which sees you squaring off against the mysterious stranger from earlier, Carlito, who serves as the game's first boss. Now this is when Dead Rising can make a bit of a poor second impression. Carlito has a sizable health bar, he's equipped with an automatic weapon, which is far better than your measly pistol, and worst of all, he's got the dreaded high ground. And this is also when we discover that the third-person aiming system in Dead Rising is absolutely atrocious when it comes to dealing with quick-moving targets. Assuming this is your first ever playthrough of Dead Rising, there is a 99% chance that you will die here, and it'll feel pretty cheap. I'm sure this is when a few impatient gamers ejected the disc and went to go get a refund. The rest of us would see that when you died, the game offered you the standard option to reload your previous save as you'd expect, but it also gives you the choice to save your current progress, informing the player that it'll carry over the next time they start a new game. And this is when you should realize that the game is encouraging you to go get some levels under your belt and explore the mall before going after Carlito, or you're free to ignore him entirely. While failing one of the main cases does lock you out from progressing the story, the game doesn't end and you're still free to explore the mall and earn experience. Maybe you last all the way to day 3 and escape, but it's far more likely you'll encounter one of the game's psychopaths and get stomped into the dirt. But either way, when you start up a new game, Frank will come back stronger than he was before, so in retrospect your first playthroughs are really just preparation for your ultimate run. Now, going through the same content repeatedly could easily get old, but thankfully Dead Rising has one of the most satisfying power curves of all time, as Frank slowly morphs from hapless zombie chow into a true action hero. There's a certain magic to your first few hours with Dead Rising. When the game kicks off, Frank's really not all that much more capable than the regular survivors you can come across, and your efforts to aid them during this period will often have mixed results. Weapons have limited durability and Frank's inventory space is meager at this point, and you always want to have at least one food item on hand as they restore health, so you're always being forced to improvise. Smashing potted plants over their heads and driving golf balls into zombies might not be the most effective way to take them out, but sometimes it's all you've got. You really feel like a character in a zombie movie, as simply navigating the mall is a struggle and every victory is hard earned. However, you should also be gaining levels at a steady rate. Now, Dead Rising isn't really a role-playing game. Sure, you gain levels and Frank's stats and skills progressively get better throughout the course of the game, but you don't actually decide how Frank will improve upon leveling up, as the game handles it automatically. There is a bit of RNG as to when exactly you learn a new skill or upgrade a particular stat, but by the time you reach the level cap of 50, your Frank will have the same exact build as everybody else's. This might make Dead Rising a poor RPG, but it makes it an extremely rewarding action-adventure game, because Frank is constantly becoming more and more of a badass. Eventually, you don't even really need a weapon to defend yourself from the zombies, because Frank can just take them out with his bare hands. And it's obvious that somebody at Capcom was into pro wrestling, as Frank learns a few moves that any fans will easily recognize. The turning point occurs when you finally manage to take down your first psychopath. Most of the psychopaths drop unique weapons upon dying, which are far more powerful than the standard stuff you can find around the mall, and getting your hands on one of these bad boys immediately makes the game far easier. If you're having some difficulty with Dead Rising, I recommend going for the killer clown who's behind the runaway roller coaster in Wonderland Plaza. Assuming you have a gun and a pretty good melee weapon, he's one of the easier psychopaths you can take down. He appears pretty early in the game's runtime, and the small chainsaw that he drops is easily one of the best weapons found in the game, making the most difficult encounters laughably easy. Also, make sure to save the guard he was holding captive, as he unlocks a secret shortcut for you. I guess that's a good way to segue into talking about Dead Rising's superb level design, and it's the kind you don't see all that often, where the entire game takes place pretty much in one location. While this does have the downside of meaning that you run out of new areas to discover pretty quickly, it allows you to really familiarize yourself with Willamette, almost like it were an actual mall. You learn the most optimal routes to hit up your favorite spots, while still working your way towards your objectives, and you almost settled into a comfortable routine. However, Dead Rising also knows just when it's time to mix things up a bit. As soon as you get comfortable dealing with the zombie mobs, a crazed cult enters the mix. Then near the end of the game, assuming you've completed all the case files, the military comes in to clean up the mess. And honestly, both of these groups are far more terrifying than the zombies. Zombies are just looking to eat you, while these guys will kidnap you and strip you of all the items you have on hand, which as a player is far worse. However, it's also worth noting that the military showing up marks the point when Dead Rising begins to run out of steam for me. There's no more survivors to rescue, and your only objective is to survive until the helicopter shows up, which means that it's honestly in your best interest to just find a comfortable spot to hide out in until it's time to leave. Just make sure it's in the North Plaza though, because Isabella calls you, telling you to come back 2 hours before the helicopter arrives, just to tell you to leave without her. You might be thinking that sounds like a waste of time, and it is, but if you don't do it, then you can't get the true ending, which unlocks overtime mode. Yeah, overtime mode. I'll be honest, I could have done without it. The idea that Frank is infected and needs to get supplies for Isabella to make a temporary cure while avoiding the military sounds cool, but in reality it just amounts to running all around the mall, picking up a bunch of stuff. Now the whole game is built around backtracking, but this is when I really started to feel it, as simply collecting stuff isn't nearly anywhere as interesting or tense as helping survivors, and it lacks any of the psychopaths or story beats. Then once that's taken care of, you're tasked with collecting 10 queens, which is just the definition of tedious, busy work. Luckily I already had 6 on me, because I had vague memories of doing this as a kid, but that doesn't make it any more excusable. Make sure to stock up on nectar, which is made by blending orange juice with orange juice in one of the various blenders you can find around the mall. Then after all that, the game throws you into a terrible first-person segment against a tank. It wasn't difficult, and I completed it on the first attempt, and I still hated every second of it. It goes against everything that the game has been up to this point, comes completely out of left field, and more importantly, it just isn't any fun. Completing overtime mode rewards you with infinity mode, which removes any objectives and just challenges you to survive for as long as possible. However, there's a twist. Frank now loses health over time, meaning you have to eat to stay alive, and food items no longer respawn. Bosses and survivors both now also appear as opponents, and when defeated they'll drop weapons and some of the best food items in the game. Now as a concept, I absolutely love it. It fully embraces the sandbox nature of the mall and manages to completely flip the experience on its head with only a few simple tweaks to the gameplay. However, in practice, it's a bit disappointing. The best strategy is to simply stock up on food and find a good place to sit tight. It's realistic, but it's not exactly exciting. You also can't save during this mode, meaning if you were to go for the 5-day survivor achievement, which is the only way to unlock the secret laser sword, you had to survive for 10 hours in one go. These days, consoles letting you put them into rust mode allows you to work around that, but if you were trying to do this back in 2006, you were SOL. Still, the idea was extremely interesting, and it's a shame that they dropped Infinity Mode from the sequels entirely. In the age of streaming, a mode like this seems like it'd be a hit. So I might not have been overly impressed with the extra modes, but it's hard not to appreciate the game, where the developers were obviously trying this hard to give you your money's worth, and that sort of care is evident throughout the entire experience due to all the little touches that the game throws in, such as the way you can cook certain foods to increase how much health they restore, or how Frank is able to perform a seemingly useless spit move that becomes far more deadly once he consumes a spitfire drink, or how running on the treadmills at the gym for long enough rewards the player with PP, because of course it does. You can also change Frank's clothes and alter his appearance at various stores around the mall, and your alterations are thankfully reflected during the game's real-time cutscenes. The gameplay in Dead Rising is full of these small and completely unnecessary touches that reward the player for their creativity and curiosity. Even the photography system, which is sold to you like it's going to be an essential part of the experience, ends up being almost completely unnecessary aside for a few side quests. Other than that though, the camera is primarily just a way to earn PP from special photo ops, although back in 2006, before consoles allowed you to capture and record footage from any game with the press of a button, it was great to be able to go back and show off your favorite shots to your friends. Now looking back at contemporary reviews, aside from the issues with the third-person aiming that I already mentioned, it seemed like most critics' complaints were centered around the AI for survivors, the inability to save anywhere, and the fact that everything is on a timer. Personally speaking, I can't wholeheartedly agree with all these criticisms. Okay, yeah, the pathfinding for the AI survivors is god-awful, I will concede that. There were times where I'd have to re-enter a store and kite my fellow survivors to a door, because otherwise they just try to phase through walls, and there were multiple occasions where they would get stuck on literally nothing and be unable to move until I gave them a friendly nudge. Getting large parties into the security room all at once is also needlessly difficult, as they have to climb a small ledge first. As you can see from this footage, what should be a very simple task quickly descends into something from Austin Powers. However, I don't really mind the fact that they need to be babysat and tend to be pretty useless unless you equip them with some serious firepower. If they were too confident, then there would be no challenge in escorting them, and when you're doing your best to get back to help a survivor who's been separated from the group, it feels like something out of a movie. Capcom also wisely gave the survivors some variation, so helping them all doesn't feel exactly the same. Some need a shoulder to lean on, some need to be carried, and some literally just need to have their hand held. Some survivors also seem more cowardly than others, and this leads to them being less aggressive when attacked, and sometimes not listening to orders because they're too busy bitching. Trying to help them is always hectic and chaotic, and requires you to put yourself into harm's way, far more than you would on your own, but as someone who's seen a fair share of zombie movies, that seems pretty accurate. And personally, I didn't have a single issue with saving my game during my time with Dead Rising. Aside from the park and the maintenance tunnels, every section of the mall has a bathroom for you to save in, so at most you're usually 5 minutes away from one at any given point. I mean, yeah, if you die and it's been like an hour since you last remembered to save, it could be pretty annoying, but at that point I'd probably just start a new game anyway. And while it is definitely possible to save, where you're simply too far away to get to the next case in time, locking yourself out of the story and forcing you to start over, that just seems like user error to me. It's funny, in GameSpot's review they criticize the lack of an autosave system. Now I'm not a game designer, but simple common sense would tell me that introducing an autosave system into a game where every objective is on a timer would dramatically increase the odds of screwing over the player, but hey, what do I know? And I guess that brings us to the timer, which a lot of publications express their extreme distaste of. Reviewers praising the game but criticizing the timer is a great example of people being able to recognize the brilliance in something but having no clue as to why it's actually brilliant. Dead Rising without the timer is a completely different game. Dead Rising works because the fact that you have to fight against the time constraints ensures that the game maintains its tension, even when Frank is essentially a walking one-man army. At a certain point, the zombies and psychopaths quit posing any real threat, and the only credible enemy is the timer, which forces you to master your time management skills to achieve the perfect run. Without the timer, Dead Rising would be a fun, but ultimately forgettable zombie-slaying experience, as we all saw with Dead Rising 4. Personally, my biggest complaint with the gameplay is that Frank's special moves are activated by hitting X and A at the same time, but A is also the jump button, so I frequently found myself jumping like an idiot instead of disemboweling my intended target. At no point could I ever seem to master it either, because up through the end of the game, it was still about 50-50 as to whether or not I'd actually do the move I wanted to. But in the grand scheme of things, it's a pretty minor complaint overall. To talk about the story for a second, it's actually pretty damn good. Despite all the wacky side characters and some campy elements, the main story primarily opts to play it straight. If we were to take out stuff like the overzealous store manager, then it actually presents a pretty grim tale. Carlito is far more sympathetic than the average antagonist from 2006, as he isn't after power or just insane, but he wants revenge on the government that was responsible for the destruction of his home. Throw in some not-so-subtle jabs at American culture, and a few interesting twists and turns, and I was thoroughly entertained for most of the runtime. I've honestly enjoyed my trip back to Willamette far more than I thought I would going into it. Exploring and wreaking havoc in the mall remains an absolute delight, and aside from the graphics and relatively small map size, the whole experience doesn't feel too dated. Sure, it's a little rough around the edges, but it's rough in all the same ways it was when it first came out. At its core, this is still an extremely well-made and highly enjoyable action-adventure game, and I feel 100% confident when I say that the original Dead Rising does indeed hold up.